You've probably noticed that Florida has been incredibly dry this spring. We managed to get some rain earlier this week, but it's not enough to begin to touch the drought in the Big Bend. Extremely dry conditions have led to county-wide burn bans and water restrictions in some areas. Gina Jordan talks with a local farmer about how his U-Pick business is faring. We also hear from Florida Public Radio meteorologist Andrew Wulfeck about how long these conditions are expected to last. And WFSU ecology blog producer Rob Diaz de Villegas talks about the dry down of the Lake Alberta stormwater treatment pond after sinkholes recently formed.
Hey, we got a little rain this week, and we need a lot more to quench the drought. Conditions are so dry that burn bans and water restrictions are in effect to various degrees around Florida. The Big Bend is experiencing the worst level of drought, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. Ironically, when I recently asked Ryan Bass about this, his Moccasin Grove farm was getting a shower.
Yes, ma'am. This is the first one in a while, and it's actually on some very good-looking strawberries this morning, and I have a U-Pick that starts in about 20 minutes. So it's going to be a wet one for the folks coming out to pick.
Bass and his wife established the business 5 years ago between Tallahassee and Monticello off Moccasin Gap Road.
We grow strawberries for U-Pick, and we grow peaches for U-Pick. So it's kind of like a whole springtime U-Pick for the strawberries and peaches. And then in the late spring and summer, we're growing all kinds of crops from cucumbers, squash, watermelons, cantaloupe, sweet corn, all that kind of stuff we take to the Tallahassee Farmers Market. And then in the fall, we grow pumpkins and do flowers and have sunflowers and a corn maze for our fall fun and have U-Pick pumpkins.
Bass says his crops are in good shape and the drought isn't an issue yet. His strawberries are growing on a plastic bed.
Of course, we're having to water more, and with our sweet corn and stuff, we have to move sprinklers where we can't get away with the dry land crops. But for the strawberries, we really want this dry spring. I can water underneath these plastic beds and keep the moisture right where the strawberry plants want them. And I have ripe fruit in field, so I don't really want a lot of water hitting them every morning or every afternoon and then it getting up to 85 degrees and kind of cooking them out there.
Bass has a well to take care of watering his crops. And while he says his farm business is okay right now, he understands this drought is a problem for others.
A lot of other farmers, are definitely struggling. Even the ones you wouldn't think, like cattle farmers, maybe people like that, and dry land farmers that don't have any irrigation when they're planting their corn and stuff. But if you think about it, a lot of people, they need this rain and they need the grass to grow to have their animals just to graze pasture and stuff like that. So a lot of people are praying for rain and hoping that we can get a lot just to kind of get us back up to, the point of, I guess, the average.
He's right. We are in a significant rainfall deficit, and it will take a lot of rain to change that. Even worse, when the ground is extremely dry, it may not be able to absorb water efficiently. The National Drought Mitigation Center says if the dry weather persists long enough, water reservoirs and wells can run dry, potentially leading to water emergencies. I got the scoop from Florida Public Radio meteorologist Andrew Wulfeck recently via Zoom, as North Florida is in what is officially called an exceptional drought, level 4.
Well, that's the worst on the scale. So you have, with the drought conditions, with the U.S. Drought Monitor, you have conditions 1 through 4. And as you said, most of the area is in that exceptional drought, while we have some of the area in that extreme drought. In other words, it's really, really dry out there. If you were to look around the country and you were to tell someone, hey, you want to book a spot to, one of the driest places in the United States that's in a drought, you wouldn't have to travel far, right? You just go outside. And it's all because we haven't seen substantial rainfall. If you look at our rainfall deficit this year, since January 1st, we're in the hole between 7 and 8 inches of rainfall. But that's not the whole story. If you look last year, we finished about 13 inches in the hole. So if you add those up, we're about 20 inches in the hole, and that is a lot of rainfall to be down.
Yeah. Can you figure out what's happening with climate patterns that has us in this exceptional drought situation?
It's really complicated because remember it all started, last year we were in a drought most of the year and now we continued that drought. It's just we haven't seen a significant pattern shift or any type of relief. Usually Florida depends on a tropical cyclone to see rainfall, and we didn't have any in 2025. Another negative is that we stayed mostly dry towards the second half of last year. So you already have up two negatives, and they just keep on piling and piling up on each other. And a lot of the cold fronts we've seen recently have been mostly dry. They've delivered a lot of cool air, but they haven't had a lot of precipitation with them. So until we can really change that pattern, it looks like this drought is going to continue for weeks, if not months, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Ugh, yeah, we don't want a hurricane, but it sounds like we could use a mild tropical storm that moves slowly.
So we're getting to the point where that is the only way I think we're going to be able to make up that deficit is if we have a slow-moving tropical cyclone. It doesn't have to be a hurricane by any stretch of the imagination, just a tropical depression, maybe a tropical storm, but slow moving is the key. And if that were to go across the area, we could easily get rid of these deficits. But remember, hurricane season doesn't start until June 1st, and the hurricane forecast or hurricane outlook that's going to be released on April 9th is going to say we're actually going to be in a reduced hurricane cycle this year, which is technically good news, right? Because we won't
Yeah.
be tracking a flurry of activity, but it's also bad news for us in the Sunshine State because we really need that rainfall. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And so you're saying the forecast in general looks like this drought will stick around for a while.
Yeah, through mid-April, we're only talking about a tenth, maybe a quarter of inch of precipitation across the Tallahassee region. That we should be at several inches of rainfall. So, yeah, a quarter of an inch, a fourth of an inch, a half an inch is not going to cut it. It's enough to get the sidewalk wet, but it's not enough to end the drought or give us any type of relief. So, at least through April, these deficits are going to continue to add up. Now, remember that our summer wet weather season starts around June 1st in itself. We see those daily afternoon showers and thunderstorms with the sea breeze that comes off the Gulf. So that is our only hope at relief at this point because we're getting in the time of season that cold fronts simply don't make their way this far south, during the late spring, early summer. They're more northwesterly than us, so we don't get in on that precipitation. And then the big question is what happens in May. May is usually that transition month to our normal summertime weather. However, there are some years in which we've seen the early summer be dry. We don't want that, obviously. So, still up for prognostication of how the summer will begin. But how the summer will begin will be key on what happens with our drought. Will we continue to add to these deficits and expand the exceptional drought status, or will we start to chip away at these totals? It's still up in the air at this point.
Yeah, we need a drought groundhog to
Yes.
prognosticate 6 more weeks of rain or no rain. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And even in 6 weeks, right? If you do the math, so we're 20 inches down, so we'd need about three quarter of an inch of rain per week. So that's even a lot. Think of that, 3 inches of rainfall a week. That's even impressive. So yeah.
I know these things are cyclical, but how often do we see a drought this bad in our region?
The reliable statistics only go back to around the year 2000, and we're right at about 2000, 2001 levels. So if we keep on adding to this drought over the next couple weeks, I think you're safe to say we're back at 1998 levels. If you remember that, 1998 was an extreme fire year across the state of Florida. Now, we've been really fortunate in the number of wildfires across the state not being as severe as what they have been in previous cycles during drought. And don't ask me why that is. Maybe that's because of, forest operations or whatnot, tampering down. They have these controlled burns that they do, so maybe that has helped. But we're looking at 1998 levels likely in a few weeks.
Yeah, we've learned a lot, and we're trying to consider that we don't want wildfires running amok, which is the situation we're in right now. I know there are a lot of concerns. We've had red flag warnings and burn bans up here.
Yeah, and hopefully everyone's paying attention to those. There's certain things people can do. Don't water your grass between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Withhold watering. I think odd numbers are on Saturday and even numbers are on Sunday. It varies per watering district depending on the rules. But conserving water, checking for leaks in your plumbing and your piping. Don't start any gas or generated appliances or cars or vehicles on top of dry grass because that can quickly grow to a wildfire. Obviously, if you see smoke or if you see flames, it's best to call the authorities because any wildfire at this time of year can grow quickly out of control. And we don't want to see that. After Hurricane Michael went through the Panhandle in 2018, we saw a huge uptick in the number of wildfires just because of all the vegetation that had been down by that monstrous storm that struck the Panama City area. We went through several hurricanes during the 2024 cycle, Helene, Debbie, Milton. So there's a lot of brush that's down here, right? And then you have the hard freezes that we had over the winter. So there's a lot of dead brush that can easily turn into a fire. So there are certain steps that people can take, certainly clearing some of that dead brush and whatnot in order to prevent a wildfire.
Yeah. I know that there are a number of impacts of a drought. And just as one example, we have some ponds and lakes drying up. We have sinkholes opening up.
Yes.
How are groundwater systems being affected? And should we be concerned about the aquifer?
That is a great point. If you have like a private well, those dry up first during this type of drought, and then the concern grows to aquifer. And you're right, as the water depletes underneath us, it opens up these new holes. So sinkholes start popping up. That's relatively common when we have extremes, when we have the wet extremes and when we have the dry extremes. That's sinkhole season, if you will, because there's just so many changes that we don't see under the earth or in the ground, in the top levels of the ground that are happening, and we don't see them until obviously they make a hole and they make an impression or whatnot. So you're right. So we will start to see more ground formations, specifically around large properties that use a lot of water. So think golf courses. Those are usually the first areas that see these depressions because, right, they have these big underground wells that they use to make the grass green. Well, if the water is not there, that's usually the first areas where we see these depressions form and whatnot.
And then about agriculture as well, that would have a widespread impact on farmers and their crops, I would think.
You are absolutely right, and it's a double whammy for them too. They went through the hard freeze, so some of them lost crops during the previous winter. But now we have this water situation where you have to restrict your watering in some counties, and we're not getting any help from Mother Nature. Usually, at a certain point, the federal authorities will step in with grants and whatnot to help farmers, but if you're not seeing water, there's really little you can do if you don't have, an irrigation system built out.
Yeah. What indicators will you be watching in these next couple of months to determine whether conditions are improving or getting worse?
So it's all going to come down to the ENSO. That's the El Nino Southern Oscillation. It's the status of the Pacific. So I'm going to watch for whether an El Nino, neutral conditions, or a La Nina is in play over the Eastern Pacific. And that will have great impacts on what the weather we see here across Florida is.
All right, cool. Anything else you think we should know about this drought?
Let's see. It's not the worst in history. We still have a long way to go before it being declared the worst ever. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an uptick in wildfires. There's just so much dry brush out there. I think that we are destined, especially us along the I-10 corridor, for an increase in wildfires over the next several weeks. So be mindful of those windy days, those dry windy days, because any type of spark, even if it's from a passing train, can easily ignite a wildfire.
Yeah, scary stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Meteorologist Andrew Wulfeck from the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So we just talked about how water bodies are drying out and draining into sinkholes. WFSU's Rob Diaz de Villegas went to Lake Alberta to see a pair of new sinkholes that have residents concerned.
In the shadow of Doak Campbell Stadium, Lake Alberta has lost a lot of its water.
Just before this interview, I received an email that showed that Tallahassee had gone from an extreme drought condition to an exceptional drought condition. So we are very, very, very dry.
That's Jody Cahoon, who oversees stormwater management for the city of Tallahassee. Lake Alberta is a treatment pond meant to capture and filter stormwater runoff. That water is released into the Munson Slough system, which feeds Wakulla Springs. It's not a natural lake, but it just did what our area's natural lakes typically do during a drought. It formed sinkholes and dried down. This has raised concerns that contaminated water has entered the upper Floridan aquifer. Runoff contains pollutants such as metals, nutrients, and dissolved solids. But Cahoon says it hasn't affected our drinking water.
Our drinking wells in this area are well below where this water enters. In this area, we're generally about 350 feet below the ground. And most of the time when it enters into these systems, it could take years to get down to that area.
Cahoon says the city sees evidence that the sinkholes are no longer taking on water.
Shortly after they formed, they did self-seal, and that was evidenced by the facility continuing to hold water. We had a small base flow that flows into the facility, and we monitor it continually.
The city is currently restricting the flow of water into that section of Lake Alberta while it caps the sinkholes. To filter water, Lake Alberta is lined with a layer of clay-rich soil, topped by a layer of organic matter like compost. While the pond is dried down, the city is also going to address the large amount of garbage that has been washed into it.
We're going to take advantage of this dry situation, and so we'll remove a lot of the sediments, which the pond was intended to capture, and removing that sediment will all be some trash removal in there.
For WFSU Public Media, I'm Rob Diaz de Villegas.
Rob joins us now. He's the producer of WFSU's ecology blog and host of the Coast to Canopy podcast. Welcome back, Rob.
Thanks, Gina.
We have a great example right there of what the drought is doing to our area when we look at Lake Alberta.
Right, yeah. Even though it's not a natural water body, like I said in the piece, it's doing what a lot of our natural water bodies do, which is it's draining down into sinkholes. And new sinkholes form every once in a while in these water bodies, like Lake Miccosukee. Within the last 20 years, developed a pair of pretty sizable sinkholes that are draining the western edge of the lake. And so that's what Lake Alberta is doing.
Yeah, I think sinkholes are terrifying. Florida would be the sinkhole capital, I believe.
It would have to be. Yeah. We have we have that limestone aquifer underneath the entire state. Yeah, it's active is what it is. It's it's a big rock formation, but it's always changing and being affected by the water that pours down into it.
Right. So Lake Alberta is along Lake Bradford Road. It's near FAMU Way, not far from Doak Campbell Stadium.
Right. So you could drive, if you're driving to it, you'd go down Lake Bradford Road, and then you could cycle to it from Cascades Park along the FAMU Way bike trail if you want to get to it from the other side. And so it's just south of a new housing complex that's being built for students on Lake Bradford, and it's surrounded by a lot of student housing. Yeah.
Yeah. So how unusual is this kind of dry down event with sinkholes for a stormwater pond like Lake Alberta?
Well, I've never heard of that happening before, but it's just common in general for a water body to have that happen. You have these pockets form inside of the aquifer, and where water piles up on top of it puts weight on it. So during a drought, if it's going to be if that normally full pocket within the aquifer, if it becomes empty, then all of a sudden, there's no weight holding up that ground above it. So you put pressure on top of it with water, then it's gonna it's gonna cave in.
Yeah.
But it's very common in our area for the natural water bodies to do that. That's anywhere, I guess, low that collects water is gonna have that happen. That's how these lakes formed. If you go to Fred George Park, I went there with the state geologist, and he was saying there's two sinkholes there that are in the process of becoming one of those lakes. So as far as new water bodies having that happen, that's happening within our area. I mean, over geologic time, but you know.
Lake Jackson would be an infamous one where periodically we have that massive sinkhole opened up. That's so weird. That's a whole different ballgame.
Right. Well, Lake Jackson is the most famous because it's of our sinkhole lakes. It's the only one that never had a dam built around the sinkhole. People have tried to alter all these other waterways in the area to try to keep them from draining, and it's sort of altered the hydrology. But when I talked to Jody Cahoon, he mentioned Upper Lake Lafayette, and that was once part of a larger Lake Lafayette, and it's cut off from Piney Lake and Lower Lake Lafayette. Piney Lake always hold water because the sinkhole that's really right next to it, but it's separated from a dam, never draws down. Same with Lake Miccosukee. Those two new sinkholes are on the western side. Those drain down. The other one, the main one, is separated by a dam from the rest of the lake. So even though it goes dry, the lake stays full mostly.
Yeah. Yeah, Jody Cahoon, who you spoke with, stormwater manager for the city of Tallahassee, he had some interesting observations about this.
We've all seen Lake Ammonia, Lake Miccosukee, Lake Jackson, Upper Lake Lafayette. They all right now have several active sinks going on, and this facility didn't see it until recently.
Were there any warning signs about this dry down at Lake Alberta?
As far as a dry down specifically that happening, no. I've heard some talk about perhaps there were already some sinkholes there that they seal, and so he talked to me kind of in depth about how when they make that water body, they put a cap of hard clay on top of it, and then a layer of sort of a compost layer. And you can see, if you see the photos on the ecology blog, I took some photos of the sinkhole, and it's a lot more layered looking than the Porter Sink Lake hole in Lake Jackson or Lake Miccosukee, where you can see it's almost like a layer cake.
Yeah.
And you can see that the clay layer, the compost layer, and then the regular sediment that's on top of it.
Yeah, interesting. What do you think this dry down of Lake Alberta says about any kind of underlying geological condition?
Well, it's just the normal underlying geological condition of Florida. It's just that we're going dry a lot more often than we have been. So, we might see more of this kind of thing, perhaps. But, like Jody says, all these sinkholes go active from time to time. This is a thing that's been happening for thousands and thousands of years in our area.
Yeah.
I did, when Lake Jackson first went down, not first, but when it went down in 2021, I talked to a historian who had been kind of mapping this out, Jonathan Lammers, and he put together a chronology of when the Tallahassee Democrat or other outlets would report dry downs. And so it used to be roughly, you can never predict these things, but roughly every 20 years or so, these lakes would dry down, Lake Jackson in particular, especially since it was never altered. But then, starting in the late 90s, that became a lot more frequent. And so, we're in drought a lot more. In the late 90s, there was a severe drought, and Lake Jackson went down for quite a while. I remember reading headlines at the time as an FSU student, not knowing anything about this area, and like, would Lake Jackson ever have water again?
Yeah.
And it filled, but then it's been partially draining now and then over time. And, really, it hasn't held water for more than a few months since 2021 now.
Oh.
So
wow.
This kind of thing is becoming more frequent in our area, so we could expect more activity, I guess.
Yeah. You spoke with Jody about how prolonged drought conditions can trigger or accelerate sinkhole formation.
There's a lot of folks that have asked this question in the last few days about what's going on here, and I think it's important to understand that North Florida sits on a limestone platform, and this limestone is highly soluble with our rainwater and our surface water. It's a little bit acidic, and it dissolves in these acidic conditions. Then you get a rapid recharge, which we had. We had 2 inches of rain prior to these formers. So that rapid recharge then puts a stress on the soils, and then that puts a pressure where there's loss of support, and you get sinkhole formations.
So let's talk about that in combination with sinkholes that are popping up in other areas. And I guess this would mostly be regarding stormwater ponds, but you can tell me. And then, of course, our concerns about the Floridan aquifer.
This is all of Florida, underlain by our karst aquifer.
Karst being limestone.
Right, limestone. And like he says, it's soluble. So limestone is like a sponge. Water can be stored in it even without these giant caves. But over time, like he said, it's acidic. So it forms these different passages and waterways. I did a podcast a couple of months ago, someone from the Woodville Karst Plain Project. I mean, they're mapping out this elaborate cave system that comes out of Wakulla Spring that's 25 miles long. And it could open up to caves that large. And then, of course, the closer to the surface any kind of large opening like that is, the more of a risk there is of it just caving in.
Mm-hmm. Is all of Florida a karst region?
Oh, yeah. Florida was for over 100 million years a shallow sea, and it built up all this limestone from, all the things, corals and snails and oysters and clams and all this other stuff. And it's a pretty large, deep aquifer compared to a lot of other places. That's why we have plentiful water, because it stores it all. So all of Florida is underlain. Even where we are, we're in the Red Hills region, we have more of a soil buildup on top of it, where some places like even down in Wakulla, they're directly on top of the aquifer, but all of it has, limestone underneath it. Yeah.
And this includes parts of Georgia as well?
Yeah, it goes into Georgia. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I just want to know from you, Rob, because you're our resident ecology expert, nerd person.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what concerns you have about this exceptional drought that we're in?
I guess, we have these normal cycles of drought and wet cycles. It's just, this drought is just part of really this period of droughts that we've had since the mid-1990s that have had these compounding effects over the years. Lake Jackson has always gone dry. These lakes have always had these dry down events, and the animals and the plants have always responded to that. I guess my worry is sort of when it starts happening so much more frequently and for longer periods of time, how do these water bodies bounce back after that? When it, if it happened once every 20 years or once or twice every 20 years, and now it's happening, for years at a time, months at a time, many times over of the course of 20 years, how does it bounce back? It's sort of, I don't know specifically what would happen, but I'm curious and a little afraid of what might end up happening as far as our water bodies. And then, even last fall, we had a lot of pine trees start going brown, and, a lot of our trees are being affected, and trees are pretty resilient. They're meant to withstand years of dryness and years of wet, but, the pine trees are just starting to become really thirsty because of drought, and other trees. I think that's also kind of concerning. And then you wonder what the long-term effects of that might be and how it might ripple out into affect other parts of the ecosystems.
Yeah. Hopefully we don't find out.
Yeah.
WFSU's ecology blog producer, Rob Diaz de Villegas. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.